Now we have another amazing speaker in this session before lunch. I'm very pleased to welcome up Associate Professor Jeremy Brownlie, who is Associate Professor of Genetics and Evolution at Griffith University. As a member of the Prime Minister's National Science and Technology Council, Jeremy has led 4 reports that explore misinformation's impact on Australian society and what might be done to mitigate it. He is a leader in STEM policy and advocacy, dedicated to promoting evidence-based solutions and strengthening connections among researchers, policymakers, industry and the community. Thank you, Jeremy.
Fantastic, and I've also got the presentation. Thanks everyone, and thanks to the Academy for this invitation. Some of the work that I'll be presenting has actually been done by the Academy, by the policy team, by the fellows, in response to questions that have been posed by the government, but also by the council in terms of the impact that mis and disinformation might have on our institutions and what might be done about it. So for those of you who are unaware about the NSTC, it's been around since the early 80s, believe it or not, or perhaps even slightly longer under various guises, but it's currently the National Science and Technology Council. Technically it's chaired by the Prime Minister, and he's usually there for the first part, but then hands over to the co-chair, Minister for Science. We're supported by the Chief Scientist and their office, and so Tony Haymet is the Australian Chief Scientist, and the Chief Executive of CSIRO also sits on that as a standing member. We're then made up of 6 different members from around Australia, various disciplines, and we're there to provide informal advice and formal advice to government. But we're also not only responding to their questions, but we can also raise issues that might be issues that we think are of concern. Now, we heard a question just before, how does one get questions up to politicians and how we get it in front of them? We raised the issue about generative AI at a point where people hadn't really heard about it. And then about 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, ChatGPT suddenly exploded, and very quietly the government said, what about this AI sort of thing? So sometimes even being in the room with the right people, it's difficult to get their attention given the breadth of things that they're faced with. But once you've got it, we're able to respond to it. So why is the council interested in misinformation? Obviously, we've heard a lot about various surveys around the place, but about 18 months ago, Cathy Foley, the previous Australian Chief Scientist, went through a process of reimagining and revising the national science research priorities. And as part of that process, she engaged with industry, business, various communities all around Australia. And one of the topics that was raised was in the community was the impact around mis and disinformation, and really a deep concern within the community about what should be done around this. And so there are 5 pillars or research priorities for the national research priorities. And the 5th one is about building a secure and resilient nation. And under that is a specific sub-priority around mis and disinformation, encouraging the research community broadly to engage in this space and identify areas that need research. So we've taken that question and certainly hearing those concerns. Obviously, there's a range of government agencies that are deeply concerned about the impact of mis and disinformation, particularly around our democratic institutions and our social cohesion as well. So I'm the sponsor of the 4 reports, and what that means is I'm a bit like a PhD supervisor in that I don't do the work, but I get to read the reports and provide some advice. But really my job is to take these 4 reports that have been written by the experts in the field and then synthesise that and then communicate that back to government with some sort of actionable advice. So the 4 reports, these we're hoping that we'll actually present these early next week, and we believe that there's an undertaking that the reports will be published in their entirety, so we're quite excited by this work coming out. It's been some time that these reports have been kicking around for in various forms, but four broad areas. One is looking at essentially what are the risk factors that individuals and parts of our society have to being susceptible or resistant to mis and disinformation. Examining the roles that formal institutions like galleries, museums and national science research agencies have in responding to mis and disinformation. Report number 2 is looking at and really a deep dive into different interventions, and particularly around ones that we think about, well, if only people had more critical thinking skills, that they would be more resistant to mis and disinformation. And so looking at those media and literacy information programs as well. And then the final one, which was authored by the Academy here, as well as its sister academy, the Australian Academy of Science, looking at the foundational biology. What is it that makes us tick, and what are the quirks in our brain that makes us particularly susceptible to mis and disinformation? So we'll start there, and the takeaway point here is that our brains are not really accurate organs, okay? We've got a huge amount of information that's, flooding at us at any one time. Some of you might be listening to me, some of you might be thinking about what's coming out for lunch or checking emails, but regardless of where your attention is, you're deeply focused on one particular area. The other thing is that we tend to engage less around accuracy, but the way that information feels. And that's in the same way that we heard this morning in the Welcome to Country. So Selena's Welcome to Country, she said to us, "You won't remember my words, but you will remember how I made you feel." And that's not just true in that discussion, but in all aspects of when we're receiving information. It's the feels of that information that then either if we're somewhat suspicious, we might feel that it's not true, but if we're taking it at face value and we're feeling quite comfortable, that's when we're susceptible to misinformation. Okay, so the other feature that is noted in report 4 is around, so obviously we've got attention, and so the bottleneck of attention, so we can only focus on one thing at a time. We've got a predisposition to novel information. We really like paying attention to novel information, and if that information is somewhat threatening, we pay attention to that. So potentially you might have seen the image here, you might have noticed that there's a lamb there, but you're probably looking more at the shadow. That's a wolf. Okay, you're looking backwards and forwards at it and trying to make that evaluation and that assessment. And that is what we're doing constantly in the environment. In terms of our cognition, so we're looking at taking all of that information, trying to determine, is this true, and does it match up with what we've experienced previously? Now, under ideal circumstances, when we're not stressed, we can take that information in, compare it back to through the memory, and then make some sort of rational decision. But if there's an immediate response that's required, a fear response, obviously that then triggers the amygdala, and then we have a whole range of different responses, some of which are useful, but in the case of misinformation that's anxiety-inducing, that's problematic because we'll start to engage with that and not really pay attention to the veracity and the meaning of that information. So what the report also notes is that things that degrade our mental capacity are likely to impact our way of engaging with information and increasing our susceptibility to misinformation. So our modern lifestyle, we've all got these devices that we're constantly checking and scanning, we're constantly distracted, we've got poor sleep hygiene, probably many of us, poor lifestyle and high levels of stress. All of those reduce our ability to resist misinformation. The other feature that is noted is that people that are in an anxious state or experiencing temporary or ongoing anxiety and depression, which is increasingly on the rise in our communities, again, they are more likely to engage with misinformation than trying to take a considered approach and work out what's going on. There was a study examining stress that was in particular related to the pandemic, and it was noting that misinformation, amongst other factors, was reducing sleep quality, which was then increasing the levels of anxiety. People were then engaging even more with that misinformation, and so there was this virtuous cycle going on. one of the problems when we're faced with sort of chaotic or something that's fearful is that we pay a lot of attention to that piece of information, and then we start to seek out other information that reinforces that knowledge. And so the problem, if we're in an environment where misinformation is flooding the zone and it's easily accessible, then there's multiple lines of reinforcing information that's reinforcing that fear, reinforcing that perception that that misinformation is actually genuine and we need to be concerned about it, and I need to respond to it somehow. Okay, so in terms of how information is communicated, the reports also, there's a lot of evidence around the psychology of effective communication, both good information and bad information or misinformation. So the first is having a simple message. You know, it will reduce the cognitive load if it's a simple message that's easily understood. It's easy for us to understand, but also to remember. The other one is around repetition. The more we hear a statement or a claim, the more we start to feel that it is somewhat true, even if we know that initially that statement was wrong or that piece of information was incorrect. We heard that in the earlier talks around menopause and some of the wellness campaigns, that people were purchasing products even though that they're aware that it's probably not going to help them, but it makes them feel good in some way. Similarly, around this idea of narrative, you know, this is another framework for this repetition, that we start to believe the repetition of that information. If we're in these small groups, we tend to have an in-group bias. So regardless of you know, where we are, we have different tribes, different groups. And if the information is coming from someone within a trusted group or a group that we identify with personally, we tend to accept that information at face value. We've already talked about the impact that fear has on our attention, and so effective messaging or misinformation often elicits that fearful response. And typically, when we're exploring for new information, we're somewhat biased in the way that we approach trying to find new information, and we really, really like finding information that confirms what we already think or feel, so there is that confirmation bias that's coming through. And effective misinformation or information plays on that. And I want to sort of show one of my favourite health campaigns is the Slip Slap campaign. Any of us that grew up in Australia is familiar with this one. It's a simple message. It's been repeated for nearly 50 years, and it's been quite an effective one. So the tools that we use, and you know, clearly advertisers are well and truly onto this, as well as political parties to some extent, but it's these things that are playing tricks on our minds and sort of hacking into the way that we think and respond to information. So what can be done about these things with this knowledge? So one possibility is to look at misinformation and disinformation as a public health issue. So rather than, you know, in the same way that we might look at drug treatments, rather than a purely legal enforcement, let's look at building the mental and physical health and well-being of society and communities to lift people's capacity to make better informed decisions. The caveat here in the big asterisk is that there's very limited direct evidence around this, okay? And so this is a gap, I guess, in the research field. So something for us broadly as a sector to consider is strengthening the evidence base that these types of programs that are usually typically targeted about improving our health and well-being might also have an unexpected benefit of lifting mental health and therefore giving us that capacity to resist mis and disinformation or just make better decisions in life. Where there's much stronger evidence is where we started to look at things like critical thinking, media and information literacy programs, and some of these are already embedded within the Australian curricula. So information literacy is defined as where we're encouraging people to see or receive information, but they're starting to read from a broader set of sources and also understanding how that information is generated and created. one of the studies that's deeply shown where people understand the limitations, for example, of online platforms. There might be a bias in the way that that information is collected or communicated. And that's fine if we understand what the limitations are. It might still be providing us with useful information up to a certain point. And so typically, where we equip people with those skills, that they're able to essentially determine the veracity or the authenticity of the information that's coming at them. The media and digital literacy programs, as I said, talked about how the information is created, but then also looking at things like civics education. So we don't necessarily have a health education program, but there's been civics education programs run by the Australian Electoral Commission, among many other organisations. They also have had a number and a long-term campaign around trying to combat mis and disinformation about that sort of stop, think and consider. So slowing down that process, trying not to promote that sharing of whatever information is coming through your social media feed and not amplifying misinformation, but really being careful about what you're putting out there. And I think it's not surprising that Australians have a high trust within the democratic institution, so our elections, even though we don't trust our politicians, we still fundamentally trust the electoral process. And so I guess potentially for the Academy here is what might be an equivalent kind of program that cuts across different areas within health that we might start to consider about, well, what is something that we could do? So that's something similar to the AEC. There's also programs around what they call pre-bunking. So this is where we know that there are the potential of mis or impactful misinformation. Okay, and financial scams are one of those areas that have been very effective, where we learn and teach people how to recognise the various scam emails or calls and not to give out personal details without certain levels of authenticity and veracity of information. And then finally, this idea of building friction in thought. And we've heard this question before, actually, about where if we are building a level of, not cynicism, but critical thinking, so we receive that information, we take that time to build. The flip side is, and it's noted in the reports, is that that applies to all information. We can't tailor it some magically how to target just misinformation. It will apply, that skill will apply to all information. We can talk about that later. In terms of if we've got misinformation that's out there and we need to debunk it, the literature does provide a structured process that seems to work, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of repetition, and a lot of money, and it's got to be very, very targeted. So the challenge here is that the ease at which mis and disinformation is created is so much easier given the online platforms and AI. So it is something that can occur, but it's also noted that not only is it the message that's delivered, but it's important who delivers that message, and it's finding those influencers, those trusted sources, the national agencies and components within our society that different target audiences respect and trust need to be galvanised and pulled into that space, and community leaders as well, obviously. So in terms of final thoughts for this, the four reports sort of outline a whole range of different things. We've only sort of hit the high points here. It does go into a lot of work around trust, and this idea of trust also being part of our social identity, that we build these teams and tribes, and trying to convince people that something that they hold very dearly is wrong is quite challenging. It can also lead to exclusion to social groups. So building trust isn't just about putting out convincing arguments, it's also a very emotive aspect as well. So in terms of competency and building that competency at scale within society to identify and assess information, there are clear examples of education programs that seem to be working quite well within our schools. So my question here is for the Academy is what is something that we might do or develop, but that's within a health lens and a health context. Examining and looking at the research around lifting our mental health and our physical health and well-being to give us the ability to actually make better decisions. There seems to be interesting data there, but there certainly seems to be a lot more research that needs to be done to link that. But certainly I think we'll be encouraging the government to examine their programs to see if there are these secondary and tertiary benefits to those programs beyond the immediate target. And then finally, calling on, I guess, all of us to continue this discussion with communities and meet them where they are, to build that trust, and build those networks and champions within the community who can talk on our behalf when the next wave of misinformation hits us. So with that, I'd like to thank you and answer any questions you might have.
So thank you so much, Jeremy. That was also an excellent talk, and I'm sure there are many questions in the audience. Please just raise your hand and we will get a microphone towards you. We have until 20 past, when we'll then go to lunch. But we're very keen to hear from people, and we want people to use microphones because it makes it easier for our recording and for people to hear elsewhere. Oh, there's one over here, so people need to just, okay, I need to look as well. I got that, and then we've got one here.
Hi, thanks. That was a great talk. Ginny Barber, I'm the Editor-in-Chief at the Medical Journal of Australia. So I was kind of constantly thinking as you were talking, what's the role of journals in this? Because I think we often feel like we're up there in a sort of distinct from certainly from, kind of the general population, but sometimes even distinct from the academic community. So I'd love to hear what you think the role of journals should be in this. Yeah,
absolutely. And so this was one of Cathy Foley's passion projects, was actually around increasing open access of journals to the broader community, so that people, and a greater diversity of people, not just people who are employed or studying at tertiary institutions or national research agencies, would have access to that information. I know that there's also some anxiety around that, where that a little bit of information can be a dangerous thing. So I think in terms of journals, part of it will be not just universities educating the next generation of students, saying this is publication, this is what it looks like. There's also an ongoing need for us to educate our decision makers up the hill. Most of them are not in the academic space and have never published. So explaining to them the issues around peer review and how we come to a consensus around science is going to be an ongoing conversation. It's not going to be one and done. And I think having journals in the room actually is probably going to be something that would benefit those conversations.
Got a question here, and then we've got one down there.
Lovely, thanks. Really enjoyed that, Jeremy. Thank you. I've got two questions. One is, so I understand a lot of the attention across the reports really was looking at how to bolster individuals to respond to this situation of misinformation or disinformation. So I was just reflecting on what we were talking about in the panel of actually just how do we stop the source of the misinformation and disinformation. And it strikes me that part, stopping the source, is the big preventative intervention. And then what I sort of heard you describing was more of we're going to help treat this situation. My understanding from the analysis of all of the deaths of despair in the US, we're really digging in behind that and how all the nonsense that is in place now was the right-wing funded think tanks absolutely have fed on the underlying social inequities within the US. And so you can do whatever you want to try and help people, with their kind of at that individual level, but until those underlying issues are addressed, people will continue to gravitate towards the disinformation. So in the discussions within the council, where does the role of basically the underlying social conditions in people's lives, where does that fit?
Yeah, so I think it's report 1, does examine what are the trends, effectively, the socio-economic trends and the context in which makes populations and groups of people susceptible to mis and disinformation. Not surprisingly, it varies depending on the misinformation that's being deployed and the time, but invariably people who are overconfident in their understanding of the world, so that there's a lack of intellectual humility, so people that tend to be absolute in their thinking are susceptible to misinformation. Individuals who feel that they are not part of the broader social fabric and context. And so those individuals or groups of individuals that see themselves marginalised from the mainstream, somehow disaffected for a variety of reasons, either economic or social or opportunity, will also stop listening to the mainstream view or the information view and start to seek out their alternative view, or essentially seeking out information that is reinforcing why they feel a certain way. So there are those issues. There's some conflict within the literature that suggests that in some instances, older Australians might be more susceptible. Really what that talks to more is about using technology appropriately and understanding the lines of communication. So financial scams, for example, tend to target older individuals than younger individuals. But we all know that younger Australians are very susceptible to mis and disinformation. So, but the main points though is where you've got someone who feels isolated. So if they're alone, they are actively seeking out like-minded people, and if within those echo chambers, it's very difficult to then access those people.
Thank you so much. We have one question. We have to finish after this one, but please go ahead, Liam.
I'll make it a good one. Jeremy, Liam from The Age, fantastic presentation. You heard some perspectives this morning from our panel on how big a threat we face from misinformation and what effect that's having. I wonder if you were able to gather any objective data on how big a problem this is, and if it's a threat we should be worrying about, or if it's something that's having a real serious impact in Australia on trust, on health outcomes right now.
So probably the primary focus for the reports was less around health and much more around democratic resilience. That was probably the bigger question, was around resilience within our democratic institutions. And that particular report was written, or that was started about 12 months ago. And I think my sense and my feeling is that as we've got another national government that's come out and said, Tylenol's causing autism, you've got the imprimatur of one of the largest Western powers and governments that's pushing interesting ideas and very concerning ideas around vaccination. That is essentially giving an authenticity to these different ideas and alternative facts. And I think the challenge is going to be us pushing back on that, saying that our experts have got the right messaging, that we're protecting Australians by engaging in different health programs, when it's now so much easier for people to access from official government websites from overseas that have a counterpoint. And so it's going to be more than an academic debate. It's going to be something that's going to require a broad engagement. I think then the challenge becomes, if it is from international spaces like the US, can we leverage on our patriotism, our sort of, who cares about that? Let's sort of focus on us. That might be part of a solution. But in terms of the potential threat, broadly to society, yes, it is a big threat to society. Certainly there was a lot of concerns in the lead up to the elections this year and last year, given the sheer number of elections that were being held around the world, that most agencies were quite concerned about state actors influencing those processes. So it's not, look, this problem is not new, and it's not going to go away, but it's certainly changing, and the volume and the speed at which it evolves is probably the biggest challenge that we're facing with now.
Thank you. So much to reflect upon. Big reflections here. So please join with me in thanking Jeremy,